The first thing I heard that morning was the marker. Wing Commander Briggs used a black chisel tip, the kind that bleeds through to the next page. He pulled her name off the rotation board in 2 strokes. Specialist Dara Vale, tail number 471. And the sound of it carried to the back of the briefing room, where I was standing with my coffee going cold. Nobody said anything. The room had maybe 30 personnel in it, full pre-mission brief for the Callow Gorge extraction, and they all watched him do it like it was a weather report. "Trainee burning a slot," Briggs said, not looking up from the board. "Vale rides the clipboard tonight. Darrow takes 471. I laughed. I want to be honest about that part. Not loudly, just enough that the guy beside me heard it. One of those half-second exhalations that says I'm in on the joke. She was 26, 18 months out of the advanced rotary course. And she had the kind of face that made you think she was still deciding whether she'd passed her. Qualls. I was a crew chief with 11 years on the Veldon flight line. I knew what I thought I knew. She picked up the clipboard without a word and walked to the tarmac. I watched her go, and then I turned back to the board where Darrow's name sat in. Fresh ink above the Callow Gorge approach diagram, and I thought, right call, the gorge was no place to field train someone. GPS denied corridor, 1,200 feet of granite on each side. Fog that rolled in from the eastern plateau after 2100 and didn't burn off until dawn. Sensing our pilots called it the needle. Darrow had 46 approaches logged on the corridor. I'd watched him brief it. He ran the waypoints from memory, 5 of them, Callow 1 through 5. Descent rate, terrain rise. The hard left at waypoint 3, where the gorge dog-legged and the altimeter became the only instrument that mattered. I trusted him completely. She spent the 2 hours before launch doing my job. Pre-flight checks on 471, the aircraft I had already signed off. I watched her walk the rotors, run the fuel transfer sequence, check the emergency hydraulics. She did it without a checklist, and she did it in the right order. I told myself she was nervous, running it twice for comfort. Told myself a lot of things that night. We lifted at 21:30. I was in the cargo bay, 18 personnel strapped in, 12 operators and 2 flight crews sitting rear-facing, and the aircraft was Darrow's, and the night was clear above the plateau before the gorge swallowed us. Vale was seated across from me on a jump seat, helmet on, hands folded in her lap, looking at nothing. I remember thinking she seemed too calm for someone who'd just been pulled from the rotation in front of Tire Squadron. I filed it under youth and went back to my instrument check. Waypoint 2 is where it happened. There was a sound like a cable letting go. A hard metallic crack that I felt in my back teeth before I heard it. And then the airframe shuddered, and Darrow's voice came over the internal feed, 3 words, flat and immediate. Rotor debris, hydraulics, then silence. I didn't understand, in the first second, what the silence meant. I understood that the aircraft was descending. I understood that the gorge walls were maybe 800 feet off each wingtip and closing. I understood that the backup pilot, Lieutenant Kara, was not responding on the internal feed. I found out later that a fragment had taken the side panel off at Kara's station, and she'd taken a concussion from the instrument housing. Darrow had his hands on the controls, but his left side wasn't moving right, and the aircraft was in a 30-degree bank that was not correcting. I was watching all of this from the cargo bay when I saw Vale unclip her harness. She moved like she'd rehearsed it. Seat, aisle, forward bulkhead, cockpit door, 4 steps, maybe 3 seconds. I heard Darrow say something I couldn't make out. Then her voice came on the feed, low and even, and she said, "Waypoint 3 is 11 seconds. Plane rises left. Stay with the altimeter." She took the controls. What happened next, I can only tell you from what I heard through the headset and what I felt through the airframe. She called the waypoints aloud. Not for Darrow, I don't think, just for the record, or for herself, because the words were a rope she was climbing. Waypoint 3, hard left, bank angle 40, recover to 25. Waypoint 4, descent rate hold, terrain corridor narrowing to 600. She was on the memorized numbers, no GPS. No moving map display on her side of the cockpit. Nothing but the altimeter and the waypoints she had loaded into her head at some point before this night, on some prior rotation or training pass or quiet hour she'd spent with the approach plate when nobody was watching. I know she had logged 4 approaches on the Callow Gorge corridor. I pulled her flight record afterward. 4 approaches, all as right seat observer, never primary. The minimum to be current on the corridor was 8. Briggs had crossed her name off the board because she was underqualified by half. She flew waypoint 5 clean. She set the descent, bled the airspeed, and she brought the aircraft down through the fog at the base of the gorge on a slope I would not have attempted with both engines and full hydraulics. The gear touched at 22:18. I know the time because I looked at my watch when the wheels hit the hardpan, and I couldn't feel my hands. 14 personnel. Every one of them walked off the aircraft. I came down the ramp last, behind Darrow on a stretcher, and Kare with a field dressing on her temple, and I stopped at the bottom because the flight line was wrong. It was quiet in a way that a flight line at 22:18 with a wounded aircraft and a 31 med team standing by is never quiet. The ground crew, my crew, 17 people I had worked alongside for 6 years, were standing in a line at the edge of the tarmac. Not at parade rest, not at attention, just standing. The way people stand when they don't know what the protocol is. But they know something has happened that the protocol doesn't cover. Briggs was there. He was standing at the base of the ramp in his flight line jacket. Shh. And I watched him look up at the cockpit where she was still running the post-landing sequence, and I watched something happen in his face that I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't shame exactly. It was the look of a man who has just been shown the distance between what he assumed and what was true, and found the gap wider than he thought he could stand in. She came down the ramp with her helmet under her arm and her eyes on the hardpan, checking, her footing on the ramp edged the way a pilot always does. And Briggs stepped forward and came to attention and rendered her a formal salute. He held it. Behind him, without any command given, the ground crew came to attention too. 17 people and then the med team. And then the operators filing out behind me, the ones who had been strapped into the cargo bay for the whole of it, who had heard her call the waypoints in the dark. One by one, without any order, they came to attention. She stopped at the base of the ramp and looked at him for a moment. Then she returned the salute, clean and correct. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. I still have the pre-flight checklist from that night. She'd signed it in the lower right corner, Vale, D, in small tight printing. After she finished checking an aircraft she was never supposed to fly. I found it in my clipboard bag 2 days later. I don't keep it as a lesson or a reminder of anything. I keep it because it is a plain fact. She had already done the work before anyone asked her to, and her signature was there to prove it. And I had walked past that signature a dozen times that evening, without reading it. That's the thing I think about. Not the approach. Not Briggs and his salute, though I've thought about that too, plenty of times since. The thing I think about is her signature on a pre-flight for an aircraft she'd been told she wasn't flying, correctly and completely at 1942 on a night in October, in the dark at the edge of the Veldon East ramp. She knew the whole time.